Hi, my name is Sam Hayes. I am author of Remember Henry Harris, Lost Icon of a Revolution. Henry was, of course, the first black athlete at Auburn University. This is Black History Month, and I'd like to talk about some of the other black athletes that integrated other SEC schools. Today, I'd like to talk about Greg Page and Nate Northington, a couple of football players that integrated athletics at the University of Kentucky. This is Greg Page, and this is Nate Northington in their Kentucky Blazers. Um, I had the opportunity to interview Greg Page's father back about 1980. And the Pages lived in Middlesboro, Kentucky, which is a hilly, mountainous town, small city in Kentucky, where Tennessee and Virginia come together. It's Mr. Page was very gracious, and his wife met them both. Mr. Page was a large man. You could see where Greg got his size. He was smoked pipe. Mr. Page had grown up in Mississippi during the Depression. He was one of 10 children. He went off to war when World War II started. He spent the last 2 years of his service fighting through the Pacific. And he came home. He moved to Kentucky, moved to Middlesboro, and began working in coal mines. He was a coal miner. He had retired by the time I interviewed him. Mr. Page had tremendous pride in his son. You could see that. Greg had helped integrate Middlesboro High School. He was an outstanding football player. The University of Oklahoma had offered him a scholarship, and that's where it looked like he was headed. And then suddenly the University of Kentucky, this is in winter of 1966, suddenly the University of Kentucky becomes interested in recruiting him. And and the governor even comes. Governor Ned Breathitt comes to their house to try to recruit Greg, convince him to go to the University of Kentucky, that this was something he could do for his state. And for that really touched Robert Page's heart, because he was a guy that had grown up in the segregated South, poverty-stricken Mississippi, and during the Depression. He'd gone off and fought in the war, came home. The segregation was still the rule of the day, despite the sacrifices of so many black soldiers and sailors. And here the governor was saying, this is something you can do for your state. So Greg Page chose to sign on with Kentucky. Now, a little background here. Within a month or two earlier, Kentucky had signed its first black athlete in any sport, and his name was Nate Northington, and he was from Louisville. And it had been an interest of the governor, Ned Breathitt, for a few years that Kentucky integrate its athletic program. Kentucky had integrated the student body way back in 1948, and here in 1963 or so, it is still not integrated its athletics. As we've talked about before, the Southern college athletics kind of became part of the resistance to the integration movement. So Breathitt had not been able to get Kentucky's coaches, football coach Charlie Bradshaw, our basketball coach Adolph Rupp, to sign any blacks. Rupp had tried to sign Wes Unseld and Butch Beard, but his reputation as a racist and the university's reputation had prevented. They didn't feel comfortable going there. And so they had both chose to go to Louisville, which had integrated athletics back about in the mid 50s. And so Breathitt was putting pressure on the president, John Oswald, University of Kentucky president John Oswald. He'd been hired in '63 partly in order to integrate athletics. And finally, Oswald came up with a deal that Charlie Bradshaw couldn't refuse. Bradshaw was had been an assistant coach under Bear Bryant, had played for Bryant at the University of Kentucky. He had been a top assistant for Bryant when he won his first national championship at Alabama in '61. Kentucky hired him. He had grown up in Montgomery, but Oswald had a deal for him. Oswald said, you integrate the program and you can have a job here at this university for the rest of your life, whether it's football coach or whatever. Okay. So with that, Bradshaw integrated. He signed Nate Northington. The signing, they brought Nate Northington. They got in such a hurry to do it. Northington had not even come to the university on a recruiting visit. They contacted him one week. They got him on Saturday. They had a big luncheon at the governor's mansion. The university president, Oswald, was there. Bradshaw was there. And he signed. Again, this was an honor. This was something you could do not only for your race, but also your state. And when he left there that day, those three white men, the governor, the university president, and the coach, said that he would not be alone. He was concerned about that, being the only black there in that athletic dorm and in the athletic department. So they said, you won't be alone. So that's why they eventually, a few weeks later, signed Greg Page. Okay. So things go pretty well the first year, certainly on the athletic football field. Northington leads the team in rushing 6 yards a carry, and Page is the leading tackler on defense. Big, strong defensive end, 6'2", probably a little over 200 pounds, and they're doing great. And they both are being counted on. At that time, of course, freshmen couldn't play varsity sports. And so for the upcoming season in 1967, they're both being counted on to be major contributors on the team. They moved Northington to cornerback, which was often the case with the early black athletes, rather than having them in the glamour spot of running back. And Page is competing for playing time at defensive end. I mean, he's already up to second team. But that summer, the Page and Northington, who were rooming together, they stayed at Kentucky that summer, which was part of the football program that they'd be in summer school so they could work out. And they held the Kentucky All-Star game, high school football All-Star game, and they come to find out that Kentucky hasn't been recruiting these top black athletes that are going to other schools. And this was something the coaches had told them that they would do if they came to Kentucky. That they would not be just token athletes. There would be other athletes there with them. Now, Kentucky had signed 2 more black players, but Page and Northington were upset that the coaches were not living up to their word, and so they left school. They left summer school. They went home, and Northington would later call it kind of their mini walkout, and they had left and stayed gone for about 3 or 4 days and did not really intend to come back. But the coaches got in touch with them, assured them they were trying to recruit other black athletes, and that they would continue to do so. They just had been having difficulty signing them. So Northington and Page come back. And then practice starts. Early practice, late August, preseason practice. And, for the first few days, they always stay in shorts for conditioning. they stay in shorts, shoulder pads, and a helmet, and they don't they don't have full contact. Well, and they run drills, and one day they're running a pursuit drill, the third day of practice, and when they kind of follow the quarterback as he's, maybe going out to pitch the ball off, they kind of follow him and just kind of get around him and stop the play by kind of bumping him around. Well, on this particular play, there ends up being a pileup, and Greg Page is on the ground, and he's not moving. And they rush around him, and he's lying there. They get him into the training room. They take him to the hospital, still not moving. He's paralyzed. His neck has been broken, and they weren't sure whether he would regain use of his arms or legs, but he's in the hospital. He's breathing off a machine. He lays there for nearly 5 weeks, and there's no improvement. His parents have come up from Middlesboro. They're staying there. His mother's a nurse. His father is there. Bradshaw is going by every day, and when he doesn't go by, Greg is asking where he is, and or motioning or something. He's obvious he's wanting to know where he is. So then finally, on a Friday night in the end of September, he dies. And the following day is the day that Page and Northington were supposed to integrate the SEC in a game against Ole Miss in Lexington, at Stoll Field in Lexington. Northington goes on and plays. Robert Page, Greg's dad, tells Bradshaw, y'all go on with the game. Greg would have wanted you to do that. Robert Page had spoken to the team during this process. He says, I want y'all to keep playing and play all the more harder because of what has happened to Greg. And so they play the game. Nate Northington integrates the league. The following day, on Sunday, they have a service at Stoll Field, the old football field at Kentucky, for Greg Page. 2 days later, they have a service at the First Baptist Church in Middlesboro. About 700 people. Governor is there. Greg Page is buried in his Kentucky blazer. And the honorary pallbearers are the 26 sophomore football players at Kentucky. And they go to the funeral. They miss practice. And then they return to Lexington. And they learn that they're going to have a practice for them that evening under the lights at Stoll Field. And, within hours after burying their teammate. And so, in this practice, Northington felt like this was sort of punishment for missing practice. And Bradshaw was notorious for brutal training. He was a Bear Bryant, Bear Bryant in the early days, brutal practices. He had already lost, he'd already been in trouble with NCAA. On his first team in 1962, was called the Thin 30, because 58 guys had left the team rather than put up with the off-season training program. So in this practice, 2 starters and a third player quit the team during this practice. Another one gets in a fist fight with a coach. And so that's what happened that night. So it really bothered Nate Northington. Really bothered. Really hurt him. During this time that Greg had been in the hospital, Northington had been in a room by himself. Said he counted every concrete block on the wall, several times. He was depressed. He didn't go to class as much as he admits later that he should have. He was just depressed. Going to football practice reminded him of Greg. And if there was any counseling available to him, nobody brought it up, he said. And then, but, 3 days after that practice, he plays his second SEC game at Auburn, where the troopers there are along the sidelines. His teammates, his Nate's white teammates, can hear him saying, kill Leroy. Let's get Leroy in there, which is, of course, a term some whites used for blacks at that time. Let's kill Leroy. And he's still at Kentucky into the third week of October. And the thing that was kind of one of the final straws for him was Charlie Pell, who was an assistant, another Bear Bryant guy, and had played for Bryant. And he was an assistant coach and a really very demanding coach. Of course, later became head coach at Clemson in Florida. He came and took Northington's meal ticket away. His ticket that enabled him to eat there in the cafeteria. And this was punishment for him missing some classes during this time when Greg was in the hospital. And he told him, Nate said that Charlie Pell told him, well, you can find, eat with some of the black people in town, like the insinuation being that if you're black, you know every other black person in town. Northington said he didn't know anybody. So one night, it's the week before they're going to LSU to play again, play another SEC team. And Northington packs his bag and leaves. But before he leaves, he does one very important thing. He gets Wilbur Hackett and Houston Hogg, the two black players on the freshman team that Kentucky was able to sign, and he goes to them in their dorm room and he sits down. He says, and Albert Johnson, who was a black walk-on that team, and he says, I'm leaving, but you guys got to stay. We've got to make this work. And so he left, and coaches tried to get him to come back, but they couldn't do it. And he transferred to Western Kentucky, where he played and graduated, and never talked about his experience in the University of Kentucky for about the next 45 years. Would not talk to interviewers, anything. Fortunately, the story didn't end there. Wilbur Hackett and Houston Hogg stayed and stayed and stayed at times when they wanted to leave. And only 2 years after Page died, Wilbur Hackett, who was a fireplug of a linebacker, was captain of Kentucky's defensive team when he was only a junior. Houston Hogg became a fullback and played regularly, starter. And interestingly, Wilbur Hackett became an SEC official, an SEC referee for 15 years, which would have never been dreamed of that there would be actually black officials in the games, which would have never been dreamed, of course, by Page, Northington, or any of the first black athletes at any of the SEC schools. The president of the Black Student Union, about 1978, had the idea of naming some new married housing apartments, the Greg Page Stadium View apartments. And that was only memory, and they did that. Kentucky did that. And that was only memory that was there for at Kentucky of Greg Page or Northington for or this integration of the athletic department for the next 30 or so years. Then in 2013, Northington self-published his autobiography, and he named it appropriately "Still Running." And he described in there how there was just too much pain. He could not have talked about it. He had become a minister in the 90s or so, and he was opened up in the book some. And this prompted him, now talking about it, prompted his teammates, his white teammates, to begin to try to get Northington and Page remembered. They had seen what had happened in the league. They'd seen what had happened at the University of Kentucky. By 1976, 10 years after they entered, Kentucky won the SEC football championship with a team with lots of black Americans on it. And the leader in trying to get something done was Paul Karam, who was a quarterback when Page and Northington were there, and became a lawyer in Louisville. And he worked tirelessly, first to get a documentary done. The name of it is Black and Blue, and it's about the integration of the Kentucky football program. And then he took it a step further by getting support for Kentucky building a statue of the 4 players who integrated the football program. They are, of course, Greg Page, Nate Northington, Wilbur Hackett, and Houston Hall. And that's outside the stadium now. So that's the positive end of a very painful story, but it preserves the history and preserves what these guys sacrificed in order for others to get the opportunity and to play and to open the state university to all Americans, black or white.